So we spoke with Marina Cantacuzino, who's the founder of the Forgiveness Project and also an award-winning journalist. And Marina and Joao and I, we spoke quite extensively about forgiveness and among other things. But I think what was really beautiful about the chat and what we really appreciated, what I appreciated, was the nuance and the layers and the subtlety of forgiveness and how non-linear it is actually, and also I think just how fundamental it is and how important it is for you as a person to forgive a lot of parts of yourself and how that sits in your relationship with other people. And actually you have to be able to do that seemingly before you can start to actualize and to grow and develop. So I think Marina just really clearly and beautifully communicated that in the chat.
Yeah, for me, I adored our conversation with Marina, and like we were talking about before, for me, it's a topic that is really really close to my heart and that I find fascinating, and I think that is an important conversation because it's so hard to forgive, and like we almost don't even have the words to even start to understand forgiveness. So I think that's why a person like Marina, who comes and like expresses it in such a eloquent and simple way, just gives us the opportunity to think a little bit more deeply about that kind of behavior that's so important and so difficult to have in our lives,
and to start to forgive,
yeah,
just to start,
just take the first step.
I think there's this this story where you kind of neglect for pretend like that's not you, and then I think there's bits of it that are calling me again, and I wouldn't say that I'm a Catholic per se, but it's like Ram Dass. Ram Dass. He was. Have you heard of Ram Dass? Yeah. So Ram Dass was a professor at Harvard. He was the one who kind of started this psychedelic movement.
Yes.
And drop in and drop out. This thing they were telling kids to get high and drop out of school, basically. But he was really influential in kind of free. Eventually became Ram Dass, this spiritual teacher. And then actually towards the end of his life, apparently, from what I hear, he kind of found Judaism again and kind of came back to some of these principles that he had been raised on. And I think there's probably something quite human about that that those whatever those things are that are really important to you or have guided your growth and development in some way, you maybe come back to. How did you find the celebration?
Actually, in the end, I found it beautiful.
Yeah.
I was expecting it to be long and interminable, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
So.
I'm happy to hear, because I know I have my mom's cousin who also lives in the UK. Her brother passed away recently, and I called to see how they were doing, but I just remember feeling in the conversation thinking I don't think I would grieve. I don't think I grieve like that, and I think there was something really Italian Catholic about the kind of that process of.
I think I do grieve like that. For me, it's like you the day of the funeral and the whole ceremony around it. It kind of helps to remember and release the whatever you have with this person. So for me, I was my great granddad. And I cried my eyes out basically.
Yeah, it's really important.
And I took the coffin, So that was kind of like I don't know, like I just felt it was something I wanted to be a part of, like to, and yeah, like I was crying the whole way from the church to the thing, but by the end of the day, like I felt released, There was, it's just, I felt that if I didn't do it that day, that might have stuck with me like internally for a much longer time,
Yeah, there's a resolution there in a way, which is interesting actually, because we are in some way, I think what you're doing is in some way trying to support a discussion or a discourse and a resolution, and actually it's quite interesting that there is that, the grieving is this kind of, you get to say everything that you wanted to say.
Yeah.
Or in my grandparents' case, they didn't speak English, so
yeah,
we could only have some level of connection.
Sometimes it's like you even a friend of mine's mom just passed away recently, and one of the things I talked with her was maybe you should write her a letter, say the things that, because she died quite abruptly, so I just told her, maybe just write everything down that you ever wanted to say to her, and just send that with her, and that's so I think I think it did help her out, because like it somehow feels like you are resolving some of these issues that were not resolved in life,
So we're here with Marina Cantacuzino, and Marina is founder of the Forgiveness Project, and we're here, I guess, to talk about forgiveness in some way, and also, maybe a resolution and and family, and welcome, and thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming, Marina.
It's great to talk to you both.
We appreciate it, and I think forgiveness is a really important topic, and for a lot of reasons, and I think also the abstract also quite an interesting thing to get into, and obviously you've seen kind of a variety of ways that is manifested. I'd be curious to hear, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the Forgiveness Project and what it means to you. What is it?
It's a hard thing to explain. It's not easy in one sentence, but you'll give me a few more maybe. And I think that's because people have all these expectations about forgiveness. And the minute you mention forgiveness, people assume you're persuading people they must forgive and that it's a really good thing, and if they don't, that in some ways they'll be depleted or it'll be a bad thing. So the Forgiveness Project is essentially a place of inquiry and examination, because through storytelling. So what I've done, as my background is journalism, is collected real people's stories, both from the perspective of victims and perpetrators, to show journey transformation. And so essentially what the Forgiveness Project does, it's a platform for sharing stories, but what I call restorative stories or restorative narratives. So they're stories that focus on empathy, compassion, forgiveness, reconciliation, and show a progression from, hate to hope, or from bitterness to forgiveness, and show how people recover, how their hearts are mended, how broken communities are reconciled. Because I started it because I knew the power of story, individual, personal story. I felt that they were much more powerful than theory.
Yeah.
I knew that because in my work as a journalist, the stories that were always picked up on or people responded to or felt they could walk in the shoes of someone else was when I interviewed real people. Those were the stories that grabbed people. So the Forgiveness Project really just puts out stories. It's also a community of stories. A lot of support through working together. Because we have exhibitions, we put on events, write books. We have a prison program where people can go in and share their stories live. And it's also become a kind of movement of people who support it, sometimes financially, but more often just in sharing on social media, the work that we do, the stories we tell, who believe in peaceful solutions to conflict. Because I suppose very broadly it is a peace-promoting organisation. But just going back to what I said right at the beginning, it is about exploration and inquiry, not about propagation or persuasion. Because one thing I'm absolutely certain about, if you tell people they must forgive, you know, they put up their defences, they're not going to. And it's not always appropriate. It's a choice, it's personal.
Yeah, and I it's a question I'd like to ask you, do you think that sometimes it's just like not possible, but maybe sort of like internal resolution and say, it's finished, but like it's too much, like to forgive maybe somebody specifically or something like that?
I think it's such a sort of grey area in a way. People want explicit definitions of what forgiveness is. But when people ask me, I sort of think the one thing that is more than what you've just described, which I would say is letting go and acceptance.
Yeah.
Forgiveness, there has to be a degree of empathy and compassion for the person or people who've hurt you. And that's the difficult bit, in a way. And that doesn't mean you condone or excuse what they've done, but you see them as human like you. Now, we could all agree that that's fairly easy with a friend you've had a falling out with, and then they apologise and you reconcile. Very easy. Much more difficult when we share stories like this, where the person who's hurt you is a killer or an abuser. And yes, it is possible, and everyone's different, and people do it to heal themselves or to reconcile with the pain or with the person, and people do it to help themselves, essentially, not to be kind necessarily.
Yeah. So there's the process of forgiveness then, from your perspective, is that fundamentally has to be about some level of understanding the person as another person with needs, with feelings, with some motivations, etc.
Yes.
And it's rather than the abstract idea of that, it's more, if you understand that individual, then you can actually start seeing them as a person rather than a monstrous event.
I mean, we were talking earlier about someone called Joe Berry, whose father was killed in an IRA bomb, and who now does talks and publicly speaks alongside the man, IRA activist who planted the bomb. And one thing she always says, which I think is very powerful,
The bomb of the attack that
Killed her father.
Yeah. So the man responsible for our father's death. I mean, it's a difficult conversation they have. It's not always easy, but they've done it for years. And one of the things she says is about Pat McGee, who is the former IRA terrorist. She says, if I had lived your life, perhaps I would have made your choices. And it is that ability to think, if I'd had the influences you had, if I had the brain you had, maybe I could have done those terrible things or hurtful things. You know, and that a lot of people can't and don't want to go there because they feel very offended when people don't behave. Well, we can all feel very offended if people don't behave as we want them to.
Yeah.
you have to be very mature to be able to do something like that. Yeah.
It's an interesting one because maybe the challenge of our time, which is, okay, well, we were talking about today was 19 degrees in Norway, the warmest day in January in the history of recorded weather, and it's really easy to say, well, you know, this person should be doing this and that person should be doing that, and what about the baby boomers and so on and so forth, and actually you put yourself in that state of mind or in that place where actually you would have done the same exact thing, or you would have behaved the same way, or you would have developed the way that you have developed. And what's the potential for that? Actually, I think that for me that's there's a question there about what does education need to look like, and I think the storytelling thing is really amazing. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on where has that gone from telling, you know, okay, we've heard some stories and we're telling a story, and actually now we're doing events now, and we've got the potential to maybe change mindsets or change the way that we teach people or that we evolve, or what's kind of your thoughts about how this thing continues to
When you
evolve?
say this thing,
The forgiveness project, yeah, this journey or this project that you've been.
yes, it's 15. Started very small in my kitchen, and it has slowly evolved, not fast. I mean, I actually think it's been a very organic process, and to push it in different directions, which every now and again over the 15 years, with the help of others, we have tried to push in different directions. But sometimes, because it is so reliant on people's stories of pain and hope, but essentially there's a lot of trauma within the organisation because people are coming with their stories of trauma. That conclusion some time ago that it was better to protect it in a way. So it's never, I don't think it'll ever be a massive global force. I think it operates under the radar. I'm still amazed at how many people have heard of it. Its reach is far, but it's never going to have offices in every city in the world. I used to think it would and it could, and that's what I wanted. But I think I'd rather protect the people much intricate and part of it through their storytelling. We keep collecting stories, we keep collecting more current stories. It's very important to collect stories when people are ready to share their stories. So, people have said, have you got any stories from Grenfell Tower, for instance? And it still feels too early for that, because the trauma of that event is still so, and forgiveness isn't appropriate. I mean, yes, there will be some people who have a strong faith who won't want to feel antagonistic towards those who were responsible for that fire. But overall, as an organisation, I don't think we should be sharing stories around forgiveness with Grenfell Tower, for instance, at this point. 10 years down the line, maybe that is the right time. So a lot of the stories that we share, the event happened a long time ago, because that is what forgiveness looks like. Restoring and repairing in the aftermath, in the time of trauma and pain and hurt. People are hell-bent on survival, and they don't want to know about forgiveness, and nor should they be encouraged to forgive. I'm a great believer in accountability, apology, and injustice.
Sure.
Time also takes, it's a part of that process. Like, you can't be expecting, without the appropriate time to have the healing process happening inside to be able to open up to forgive. At least that's my feeling.
I agree with you, and the evidence bears that out. There is a thing that we talk about, which is premature forgiveness, which isn't helpful. And there is one woman whose story, again, her son was murdered, and she was very, very strong, possibly Catholic, I can't remember, Christian, very, very strong Christian, and she believed it was her duty to forgive the killer. And she spoke about forgiveness, but then she also said, in hindsight, she looked back at herself, she said, I haven't forgiven at all. I felt I should. Inside I was full of hate and bitterness, and actually I was driving everyone away because it was coming out in anger.
Ways,
And it was only sort of several years later she came to meet the man responsible for her son's death in prison. And they had a very profound meeting, that she understood what forgiveness was, that she saw him as a human being.
But without that space,
Exactly.
Then that wouldn't have been possible.
No.
It's interesting because it's almost like you have some degree of trauma that comes from any particular act. Like you might say something that's I feel uncomfortable, and that maybe I needed an hour, or maybe I'm well practiced and I can say, all right, Joao, I know that's you, or that's my emotion. I have to be responsible for my emotion. But it's interesting because I remember hearing Maya Angelou talk about forgiveness, and obviously also a very strong Christian. And she said she was, I think, quite almost flippant about it, but it was quite light, and it was like, okay, I'm done with holding whatever I'm holding against you, but also I'm kind of done with you as well.
Yeah.
And I thought that sounds like someone said something to you or flipped you off or but there is, because maybe actually time for something like that is maybe more of a hindrance, where if it's something smaller, actually maybe you don't want to hold on to it very long. And and obviously we're talking about things that are incredibly traumatic.
But also, I mean, a friend of mine was telling me about a falling out she'd had with a very close friend years ago. What she told me was a really good example, I think, of how actually forgiveness is very much about body language and less about verbal language. Or less about sort of asking for forgiveness and giving forgiveness, and less about using the word of forgiveness. So she was just telling me, and this is very common, that this thing she'd been holding on to, this resentment of this person who hurt her. I don't know what he'd done. And they kept friendly, but it had been, not really close and a little bit difficult, and she kept thinking about it years and years. And one day he came to stay with her and her husband, and he said, I want you to know I've been thinking about that over the years, and it wasn't right. And that's what he said. He said it wasn't right, I shouldn't have done it. That's all he said. And it was enough. It was the acknowledgement and the accountability that she looked for. And she said, that's all I needed to hear. I just needed to know that he'd seen that it was a bad thing. And she said, I felt totally different. I let go of it all. It was so close again, And it's so interesting because it wasn't really about forgiveness, and yet it was all about forgiveness.
Yeah. It sounds like in that case too, we experience reality in a certain way. You say something, actually it's not quite the way I'm imagining what's going on here. And if you don't acknowledge that, or I don't acknowledge that, there is this kind of tension that will stick. And we've experienced it in our families as well, and with siblings, and these kind of underlying things that are unresolved for many years. And they just away.
They do.
And it's so, as a facilitator, you walk into a room and there's a group of people, and those things linger, and actually they're really as simple as like, are you stating reality how I'm seeing reality, and if not, can we? And I think what you said about kind of the empathy, and all it takes is just an opportunity for you to just see from my perspective for like even a split second.
It's interesting to think what happens when someone won't accept you. Or say, I don't know if you've ever been in this situation. I have, where I've hurt somebody, but I don't really know what I've done. They haven't told me, and I've apologised. I've accepted I've done something that's been unhelpful or hurtful, and they haven't accepted it. And this particular person just refused to speak to me again. And no matter what I said, that was it. And I think that's a really difficult situation because they won't forgive you. And you want them to forgive you, and you've apologised. But I think my lesson in that was just that, not everybody's going to like you always. And that some friendships don't last forever. And that, because I actually felt very angry with him as well for a while. Because I thought, why don't you forgive me? Why won't you be my friend anymore? And it took me a long time to actually accept that it's perfectly reasonable for him to make those choices. And this happens in relationships a lot, doesn't it? With someone who falls out of love with someone and the expectation that it must go on forever, and that you and therefore you must always feel this. So I think forgiveness is so about accepting that people will change their minds, that people will stop loving you, that people, and that they actually have every right to, and you have to let them go. Because
that's really the like, it's the only way that it's real love. It's the only way that you have to accept the other person for whatever they are. And that's not saying that you should try and help them along the way if they do things that are hurtful for you or that you don't feel comfortable with or whatever, but there has to be that.
Yes.
At least I think so.
And people then heal much quicker and are able to move on and find other relationships. When you cling on to something, I think, bitterness does far more harm to the person holding the bitterness than the person it's held against.
What is that? Because I was having a conversation very, very recently with a family member, and I think with this particular person, I felt like, okay, I'm old. I'm old enough, and there has to be a point where I just take some responsibility, and for me that meant I'm going to expect. I'm not going to expect this thing that I should think I should get, whether that's affection or unconditionality or whatever it is, and we had this conversation, and there was something that was said that I didn't appreciate, and it wasn't a strong emotional reaction, but I knew it wasn't true. And I said, hey, I don't think this is true, actually, what you said. And what I'm hearing is, you're mixing maybe me with someone else, but I just don't think that's how we talk. And I think part of me wants to, part of me is still maybe like, you should be this person that I need,
Yeah. Yeah.
And part of me is saying, you have to kind of you just have to be, you have to be responsible for yourself now, and that thing feels like part of this conversation.
Yes.
Which is, okay, how much is this for me? How much is this of this thing that I need from this person? And that feels integral to this forgiveness discussion.
It is, and I think it can change as well, doesn't it? And this thing that forgiveness is a place you arrive at where everything's fixed and suddenly okay is not usually the case, actually, because things can happen in your life and trigger painful feelings again, or something can happen. So it's ongoing.
That's a really interesting way to see it. Yeah, I have never had, but I kind of always felt like that.
Do you have an example?
No, just no. I mean, just in terms of expecting that something is finished. Like it doesn't. It's. I mean, if you care about the person, especially sometimes these things are, there's just it's the past. It can't be changed, can be accepted. But you're right. It just brings back. Some things can bring back old feelings and things that you thought were resolved, and you just have to.
Exactly.
Maybe it's not gonna be as hard as last time, but it's still a part of that process, and it's always there. It's so you have to organically sort of feel it and see how you feel. Maybe give yourself some time. Maybe explain to the person that okay, I need my space now. It's okay, I still love you, but
I don't really know how you are going to react. I read something recently which I found quite moving. Jean-Michel Jarre, a French, very well known in France, musician, was describing his terrible relationship with his father, who he felt had never loved him. And he was talking about his father was dying, and he was at his father's deathbed, and he went to see him. And he sort of came to the conclusion that there was a hardening in his father's heart, that he was in some way, what he said, handicapped to love his son. So he was thinking it through like that. Mm-hmm. And then he heard himself say, just before his father died, he said, "Father, please forgive me for not being able to be loved by you." Completely flipped it over. But the amazing thing was that he said that it released everything for him. And it came from nowhere. He didn't know he was going to feel that, but it somehow made total sense to him. And it was and in that sort of case, I imagine that probably was concluded because it was at his father's deathbed, and it was necessary for him to move on. But very often, life doesn't go the way we expect it to, does it?
Most times.
But
it's very the very famous Rolling Stones said it. Sometimes you don't get what you want, you get what you need.
Yeah.
Do you notice? Have you noticed over the 15 years in the kind of synthesis of the stories as they come in that you notice these trends or these skills or these things that people require to have those moments, or
Yes, most definitely. And I've pinned it down to 4 or 5.
Amazing.
They're in all these share. Yeah, well, the first thing is curiosity. It seems to me that if you don't move from why me to why you, why them, you can't forgive, or you can't have empathy or compassion. Because if you think you've got everyone figured out, you have quite a blinkered perspective on life. So asking questions and having curiosity about another person is key to trying to understand them. And then, of course, that is about a broadening of your... Because this black and white thinking, I'm right, you're wrong, is actually a very unforgiving attitude. It's easy in a way, because it makes life very simple.
Yeah.
I have my parameters, I know exactly who I can be friends with, who I can't. If you do this, you're out.
Yeah.
A lot of people do live their life like that.
It's like an accepting of greyness.
Yeah. Yeah.
The kind of that you
Forgiveness is definitely accepting of the greyness, and that people won't. Good people do bad things, and bad things happen to good people.
Exactly.
Life is morally complicated.
Life is morally complicated. That's a good one.
Yeah.
And that builds an empathy, which is about letting go of resentment, and once you connect as human beings, even if that person has done terrible things, but you see a grain of humanity in them, that is about forgiveness. And I think key to it all is this ability that people have, and I learned this through the stories, to make meaning out of pain.
Yeah.
So that is moving from the narration of an offence to you as hurt feelings, to the narration of an offence to you as something of significance.
Yeah. And as a part of a story, like I was just, you're talking about greyness, and I was just thinking, like, some of my favorite characters in literature and movies and everything are great characters, and that's like, they only feel real even if they are kind of flawed. Yeah, like, nobody is perfect, and there are evolutions and people transform. I mean,
it's the archetype of the hero, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's but yeah, that is like, it's an interesting idea that it's these flawed people that we actually connect with. You know? If you see it through that lens, then it changes the whole narrative.
And Shakespeare talked about the most evil of people. He talked about them as ruined pieces of nature, which I thought was...
That guy's got good words.
That's very lovely. So the third one then is about meaning making.
No, I think we moved to the fifth. Okay. Curiosity to broadening perspective, to empathy, to letting go of resentment, and meaning making. Although those are just aspects, not in that order necessarily.
And it's
a
process. You think
it can be a process, but it comes in different orders. I don't really believe in stages necessarily, but I think the thing about the meaning making is that everybody I've ever talked to who has been on this process, journey towards forgiveness, has made use of what's happening to help others.
Right.
So meaning making doesn't mean you suddenly make sense of everything, because some things are senseless, but it means you put meaning back into your life by relentlessly pursuing what matters to you. And what matters to you is often helping others, or a support group, or it might be gardening, or walking in nature, but it's something that you put your whole heart and soul into, and that's what
is a change in behaviour.
Changing behaviour
from a change in an emotional reaction to something, and then that just transforms into, if it's dealt with, at least that's what I'm hearing.
But it involves other people usually, or as I say, it could be a relationship with nature, but it is something that fires people again. And so one of the storytellers that we have, for instance, is someone called Jill Hicks. Now, when we had the London 2005, Jill, who was an Australian working here, lost both her legs in the bomb. And she hasn't actually, a lot of the stories don't actually say they forgive. She doesn't talk in terms of forgiveness, because she says she's not here to forgive the suicide bomber, but she is her work has been from then to now about not hating and about understanding why someone would do that. Why would someone who doesn't even know me want to kill me?
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about understanding, building bridges. But she talks life 1 and life 2. So life 1 was before the terrible incident, and life 2 was after. So it was a different life. It was a life that had a lot of pain, still does, and difficulties, but it also broadened her perspective, let her do new and amazing things and meet people she would never have met, and opened her in a way that wasn't open before.
Mm.
And in some ways was much richer. Having said that, she'd rather have life. Life is still incredibly difficult with the disability she has.
Yeah. So the trauma is a provocation to a whole new world, essentially.
Yeah.
A kind of death and rebirth. I mean, life 1 indicates a kind of death, right?
Yeah.
And life 2 says, well, actually,
Yeah. And another talks about finding the, you know, and you do, you know, it's not necessarily forgiveness but forgiveness can be part of the story. But finding the gift in the wound is a way people do get through trauma.
Yeah, you almost have to. It almost feels like you have to start from that place which is actually this thing is a gift in a way, and maybe it's not the thing I would prefer.
Yeah.
But it is a provocation. It's a gateway. It's a new life.
Yeah.
And if I can just position my mindset that way, the other things maybe become a bit easier. Maybe it's a bit easier to say, well, who is this person that I've never met who's tried to kill me? Obviously, I haven't been, but that feels quite crucial, anyways.
I would agree.
And it's acceptance of that it is a different thing now.
Yeah,
I think.
exactly. And not fighting to get back to how
Yeah.
you were before, and how, you know, that is the only reality now. It is accepting new reality. Yeah.
Do you think that that self-acceptance of like new situation is part of this this forgiveness, even if you don't do it specifically with a person?
I think so.
You've
I
heard
think self-acceptance is also very connected with self-compassion. Because if you don't have compassion for yourself, it's hard to have it for others. And if you're not humanity, you can easily dehumanize others. And I think self-acceptance is part of that. It is very important, because otherwise you're forever beating yourself up, which can lead to self-harm and can create damage in the world.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, to yourself and to others around you.
It's an interesting thing, because a close person to me said his dad not basically like left, and he sees the whole situation as, and I think he has dealt with it. Maybe dealt with it is not the right word. Accepted it, but later in life, sisters from his dad have tried to contact him and say, you know, like, we're your sisters and whatever, and he just said, sorry, but you're not. And I like, my dad is dead, you know, like, and it's not, I don't think that he's deceiving himself. He understands the situation, but that's the way he
it's the only way
to
to deal with it right now. Everyone deals with it in a different way.
Do you have you seen this process of self-compassion in some of the stories people have described? They've been able to maybe just take care of themselves in a new way or better, and that's kind of...
Yeah, there's a couple of stories that instantly come to mind, and actually both of them are to do with rape, where the women concerned, one over years and one over months, did one form of self-healing after the other, whether it was reading self-help books, taking courses, going on. They went inwards, both of them went inward, knew it was the only thing they could do before they came out again. And it was what saved them. Because another thing that can happen is, I noticed this the other day, 2 or 3 people's stories, that having children can trigger a lot. It can work either ways, actually. It could either trigger past trauma, because especially if it's and so sometimes these things can lay dormant for a while. And this has happened with one of the women I was just talking to. You know, she was dealing with it, she buried it, then she had her child, and it all came up, and then she decided she had to work on herself.
Yeah.
You know, these are quite enlightened people who are prepared to go on that journey already. But both of them would say there was no alternative. The alternative was death. You know, they would with the pain. You know, and it is all about. It is forgiveness in many ways. Is a pain management strategy if you look at it. You know, it's quite useful public health.
I was going to say, what's the opportunity for public health?
Because it allows you to deal with trauma.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's not always the right way for people.
It's an amazing thought if you imagine it as a pain relief in a way. And actually, the talk that I saw a couple of years back was extraordinary because he said it was at one of your events, and he had this thought experiment, which was just could you imagine if a previously colonized country said to its previous colonizers, like a country in the Caribbean to a Western European power, we forgive you, and we do it in a way that is actually lined with some. We appreciate where we're at, et cetera, et cetera. We understand from your point of view, we would have done the same thing, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And what is the potential for a group of people, a community, a nation that kind of aligns around this idea of forgiveness?
Yeah.
I thought, wow, I've never heard.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not obviously. There's an incredible amount of trauma, and there's a lot there. But as a thought experiment and as a concept, in ways, it's quite extraordinary.
Hopefully, that's the path we are walking. It might take us a while, but
Yeah, I mean, I think all those things could be, even acknowledging that what happened in the past was wrong.
Yeah,
is the
yeah.
first step.
of course.
I think people are also looking for justice, and then what does justice look like? You know, and that is quite problematic.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it means restitution. You know, like after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, South Africans who'd been really hurt were promised money, basically, that never materialised. So that didn't help. Being promised, maybe it would have been better.
Yeah, right. The expectation.
Yeah, the expectation.
And it's probably not even about the money; it's about the promise.
Yeah, exactly.
This happened with Zimbabwe as well, with another kind of going back on promises of land reconstitution. And do you notice the difference, or do you guys explore the difference between kind of more local stories? I know there's a program between in Rwanda between the Tutsis and I'm forgetting the name. The Hutus, and obviously you just mentioned South Africa. Do you guys explore those kind of distinctions, or?
Yeah, in the sense that if you look at conflict between two groups, and that could be also with the indigenous Aboriginals in Canada or Australia or in Sierra Leone or South Africa, as you say, I think it's much more. The whole conversation about forgiveness is much more complex for the reasons we've just said, to do with justice. But there are processes that have been very effective. There are the Gacaca courts in Rwanda, which is like a community court for people. It's like restorative justice, really.
Right.
So restorative justice, and it's happened also in some of the some places in Canada, because there's a lot of pain and hurt in Canada,
Yeah, of course.
similar to Australia. But in my view, the only thing that really works is when people are held accountable and when people have safe spaces to share stories. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa went a long way to do that. And definitely, many people think, stopped further bloodshed being shed. But restorative justice, I think, is the way forward for conflicts. which aren't interpersonal, but intergroup,
Yeah.
much more complicated.
Yeah, a lot of complexity there.
Yeah, and arguably is forgiveness what they're looking for? Probably not. They're looking for justice.
Mm.
Sure.
And what's
And
justice?
accountability and apology and remorse and these things are just as powerful as forgiveness.
Yeah. Are you familiar with what happened in that particular? Okay.
In the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, yeah, a little. I mean,
Is there a kind of consensus about what it was that was so powerful and useful in that process?
I think the sharing of the stories and being heard.
Mm.
Yeah.
Do you think that you're talking about like that justice, having that justice, whatever it might be, even if it is understanding that the other people feel remorse for certain actions, can actually be a part of the healing process
Yes.
for the.
I think so. I think actually the idea that punishment is what rehabilitates isn't very true. I think what rehabilitates the victim is to know that the person has accepted what they've done wrong and has agreed to change and will make reparation, some kind of restorative action, not being locked away necessarily. And I think in this country we have something called restorative justice, which is where victim and offender meet face. They'll only happen if the offender is willing and able to apologise. And the victim gets huge satisfaction from it because they hear what happened, they're able to express their own pain. And
even probably for the perpetrator, it's a form of, you know.
definitely. And hard. I've heard prisoners, because we do some work in prisoners, I've heard prisoners say, harder than serving my sentence was meeting my victim. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's saying something.
Yeah. But in terms of, there's been a lot of research done on this, and it has shown between 15 and 27% decrease in recidivism, which means less people going to back into prison, involving, which is huge. Nothing else has shown that much. And for victims, it shows 80% satisfaction. And normally, the criminal justice system, as it is about 15% satisfaction.
Wow.
So it's well researched and highly effective, but it doesn't really involve forgiveness in the sense that forgiveness may well be an outcome, and actually often is. We have many restorative justice stories, but it should never be an obligation because it's just about the other actually.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be expected either.
Do you mentioned that earlier as well as this kind of the word forgiveness maybe to some people is quite a strong assumption about what is expected of me, or there's maybe guilt involved in that as well. I have to forgive but what do you think is useful in the kind of broaching of an everyday conversation around forgiveness when you're trying to balance this anxiety people might have about what is expected of them in terms of the forgiver, you know? What have you learned about how you kind of broach the topic?
It's such an interesting one because it sounds really weird, but in some ways I almost say leave the word out of it, which is bizarre.
Yeah.
And I think that's because it's burdened with piety. And also it can almost feel like an act of aggression. So if I say to you, I forgive you, you know, you're immediately going to become rather defensive and think, what the hell have I? It can be a bit, you know, like me bestowing forgiveness on you. Nevertheless, you know, the way and I think that's all to do with history and expectation and association. Yeah. And everyone thinks it's to do with Christianity and rather, you know, just for the mentally strong or the morally superior, and it's got all sorts of negative. But nevertheless, I find it fascinating. Yeah. And I think it is a real powerful process of transformation. And my favourite quote, which isn't actually a definition, it's more a description, is attributed to the American writer Mark Twain, and he said, "Forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it." And I like that because it shows that forgiveness grows out of damage. Some pain has to have occurred, someone has to be hurt. That it's messy, you know, this image of the violet all crushed under the heel. But also that from it comes this amazing fragrance, this healing balm. And I think in a way that's my favourite description of forgiveness. I think it's also really important to think that forgiveness, failing to have an angry, painful, emotional response to something.
Yeah.
It means feeling that pain,
Yeah.
but not responding with vengeance.
It is the crushed field.
Yeah. And it means not being defined by what's hurt you and not being identified as the single thing that's your grievance.
Yeah. I wonder how we teach this, because it feels like resilience as well. It feels like the person who can forgive and can be forgiven is also, as you said earlier, there's a maturity that.
A material, yeah, I don't know. And there's also resilience, yes, but also sort of soft, malleable sense that I really do think that people who forgive, whether it's small or big things, and everyone's different anyway, what's big to one person is small to another, is they're people with very broad perspectives on life, you know, that don't understand everything and are very happy to say they don't understand everything. You know, and
there's a
quite, and
vulnerability.
I see softness in them, gentleness and kindness. If that's resilience, yes.
There's a bravery and a vulnerability to that, I think.
Yeah,
which
there's
is
definitely a courage associated, because actually to forgive someone can be very isolating, because people don't really like it very much. They don't want you to very often. And your friends, like a good example is another of our storytellers who was beaten up and left for dead and nearly died, and you know was in and out of hospital for 2 years after that. And the day he came came conscious after the attack, his friend was in bed saying, "We'll go and get him." You know, and he's one of the rare examples actually, who I would say didn't take years. Instantly, he felt forgiveness towards the person who'd done this to him, because he desperately wanted to know, what does it take for someone to have seen his life so worthless? I need to know. And years later, he met him in a restorative justice meeting. But his wife found it very difficult as he talked about forgiveness, you know, in those early years. And she came around eventually, but she wasn't
ready
him.
to forgive.
She was certainly not ready to forgive, nor were his friends.
That's
and he
interesting.
felt very isolated. And that's not uncommon.
That's really interesting though, right?
And that even, like, in my perspective, that even shows how much more evolved he was, like, in comparison.
Yeah, and he's an example of someone who'd done a lot of work before, and he was a very spiritual kind of guy, and it was something that sustained him. And it doesn't necessarily happen that way, but with him it had really, and I think Jo Berry, who we were talking about before, when her father was killed in that mob, she'd spent several months in India before that, and had come, but she's interesting as well, because she said she spoke about forgiveness a lot in those early days, and now she looks back and she thinks she shouldn't have. She thought it was wrong. She didn't know what it meant. She said, "I didn't know what it meant then, but I felt I should." You know, that goes back to the premature forgiveness thing. So it's very complex.
It has to be an intention, and it sounds like it has to be something that you truly feel and believe in, as opposed to
But you can line yourself up for it. I think intention is exactly the right thing, because that's the first. It means something different to everybody. I mean, I kind of know what it means if I think about things in my life. I know when I've forgiven someone who's hurt me, bearing in mind that they might not think they've hurt me, but it means that I'm at ease with them.
Yeah.
And I'm not blaming them anymore. particular one, you know, and it's just a feeling, isn't it?
Yeah.
And also,
Yeah, because it's
Yeah.
also a feeling.
it's also a
So
feeling,
you're
and
saying
it's
we
still
should-
in our head.
So
It
you're
just won't go away.
You're saying we should connect with our feelings, and that's a good idea. I'm just conscious of time. I think it's. I was also thinking about you the other day because I was watching a film, and I think it was about Mr. Rogers, an old American TV star for kids, and they were asking him the burden that he felt for how he had kind of positioned himself in regards to young people and being this role model, and he talked a lot about emotions as well. But I'd be curious to hear how that's worked for you in terms of you are kind of the head of this organization and this in a kind of way, in a movement in a way, and you then are now somehow a kind of bearer of the idea of forgiveness, you know, and I know my work as a facilitator, I'm very conscious of when I'm not at work, am I being my teams to be, or my groups to be, and am I integrated, and am I living this life that I claim that I'm living? And I'd be curious to hear if that comes up for you, or how that's evolved in 15 years.
I mean, if I think, are you asking whether I, in my life beyond the Forgiveness Project, use all that I've learned within the Forgiveness Project and how I'm perceived?
And also, I guess, more like how it sits for you and how you've evolved and your perception of yourself, and because I imagine also, you know, like the idea of the podcast is that these people who are creating things, and they're either that's whether that's a project or a charity or a piece of art, or these pieces of work that Jess has made, and these mean something to Jess. I mean, this is this kind of collection of his
Heritage.
Western heritage, African heritage, and I think there's an aspiration in this work from Jess, and
It's like a meaning.
Yes. Well, I think for me, I mean, I started the Forgiveness Project by accident. It was not a thing I set out to do. And I think I started it partly because of the Iraq War in 2003. I felt there was such an angry dialogue going on, and I wanted to find stories which were about compassion and empathy for people who had been hurt and others to show revenge and retaliation. I also think I've always really believed in peacemaking and not hating and apologising. You know, it's just been part of my nature, really, from when I was a child. I've been so comfortable around stories of pain. I had a lot of death in my childhood. My brother died, my two cousins died, disease. And I think that's what led me to journalism, actually, because I started writing about disability and about, that one thing led to another. But when I started the Forgiveness Project, I had no idea that it would still be going 15 years later. And I do find people do have expectations, that sometimes on Twitter, I have my own account, and I do a bit of the Forgiveness Project and all of mine, obviously. Get angry about something. And while I never use angry words, I might retweet something that has a strong position, and people say, "Ooh, I thought you were the Forgiveness Project," and things like that.
Yeah. I thought you were the Forgiveness Project.
And they don't like it. I'm supposed to be all love and sweetness and kindness.
Sure.
And to have no strong feelings about injustice.
Which is humanly possible.
Yes.
I mean, that's the whole great thing. I mean, you do feel these things, and it's just more how you process.
But I'm very careful now about what I say publicly, because I really believe in what Brené Brown said. Do you know her? She's brilliant.
Yeah.
Yes, academic, American. And she says she's really cautions people against name calling or saying nasty things because she says we just poison the water supply from which we all must drink. So I think it's a much stronger position. Yes, certainly pull people out and say this is an injustice, but do it always politely. That's what I try to do now, because I don't think it's helpful, and there's so much anger out there, and the discourse is so nasty, isn't it?
Yeah,
And
especially on Twitter.
And it's I think whenever you have like a feeling like anger, it's almost, what's the word I want? It takes over you in a way like like a demon or something like that, you know, like and then it's so easy to just let yourself be guided by that energy, and then you're just like feeding it more and more and more, and especially in spaces like that just like creates that like triggering or whatever you want to call it, and then people just want to like inside of that space, and it's just you just as easily like choose to not do it, even though people don't think that's possible. It's actually very, very simple. You just say, I'm not going to be angry.
I'm not going to use this. I might say that in my mind, but I'm not going to verbalize.
Yes, I think there's something about social media, particularly Twitter, where it's just giving oxygen to it. And I think, especially since the Forgiveness Project is all about sharing these, what I call before, the restorative narratives. It's about trying to focus on compassion, empathy, forgiveness out there, because stories are powerful, and stories of hate can just as easily, create a world full of hate and division. So the stories we share are so important. Therefore, I thought to myself, well, our language is really, really important. So one thing I can do is be careful about my language. And the words that I use.
I think we're really unaware of also the impact of the subtlety of language and energy that we put out, and how that affects our day, how that affects our relationships. I think even something as subtle as these words of frustration, or even if they're not directed at anyone necessarily, even they're directed at ourselves.
It's carelessness. We're just carelessly using words that you don't mostly, like that's the thing. Like like if you were a bit more precise in what you were saying, then you maybe not even say anything close to that, but it's just like it's okay. Like I'm not really paying attention to what I'm saying,
I think I was doing an exercise recently at a workshop, and we had to kind of explore sensation in our body and what were kind of the key points of feeling in our body. And I was coming back to this in my upper back. And then the idea was, if that point in your body could write you a letter, what would it say to you? And I remember thinking, oh, you don't take care of me, and this thing, and before I started to put pen to paper, I was already realizing this really critical, kind of angry voice that was challenging me. That's the way that you talk to yourself, And it was quite a moment of like, okay, hang on a sec, is that actually the kind of letter that I want to write to myself? And am I writing that letter to myself every day, actually? And so subtle, and really powerful.
Difference.
Yeah.
Also, I think it's important, I have 3 children, and there's a situation in the family, which I won't go into, but there's a situation where they feel something that someone else has done. And they all feel a bit, hurt by it, and think it's not fair. And in many ways it's not fair. And I tell other people about this, they're quite appalled by this thing. But all I can do, and some people might say it's wrong, is to try and get my children to see, I can actually see why this person has done this thing. If I put their shoes, I can absolutely understand it. It makes perfect logical sense. So I spend a lot of time when we talk about this thing. Well, it's not a lot of time, it's not like a massive thing, but I try to encourage them not to feel hurt or a bit bitter about it, because I can just see how these family things can blow up and extend across the generation.
Yeah.
You know, and I suppose that is about forgiveness, isn't it? It's about
It is.
Acceptance, forgiveness, letting go, just accepting that, okay, it's not fair. Life isn't fair.
What do they say to you? Mom, you know, we don't want to hear
You know
it.
what they say? The typical
We're entitled to this.
yeah, in a way they are.
Yeah,
But
for
I
sure.
know I can just, it hurts me as well because this, remember, I don't want them to have a falling out. You know, we've never, in my family, we've never had any fallings out, which I think is an amazing achievement.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the big, broader family,
Yeah.
cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents.
Yeah. Well, do you want to ask Marina anything else?
I think I just want to thank you.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, I've enjoyed the
Bye.
I think it's been really insightful and really rich, and I really appreciate you coming and sitting with us for an hour. So,
Lovely. Thank
That was
you.
amazing.
all right, thanks, Marina.
Cheers.